February 16, 1929, Beverly Hills, California, 11 o'clock sharp. In the vast hall of the Greystone mansion, whose walls are clad in gray Indian limestone, a sound echoes like a hammer striking steel. It is a gunshot. The sound comes from the eastern wing, from the guest bedroom at the end of a long corridor. In the house, which spans 46,000 square feet, the echo fades slowly. Outside, there is an unusual silence for this area. But inside, chaos begins that the Doe family will try to cover up for the next 100 years. Lucy Doe, the mistress of the estate, is in her bedroom. She does not scream. She does not run to the phone to call the Los Angeles police or the county sheriff. Instead, she takes an action that will forever change the course of the investigation. She picks up the receiver and dials the number of the family doctor, Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh. The doctor is at a theater downtown, and it takes him time to reach the Beverly Hills. For the next 40 minutes, in the house where a man may be dying, no law enforcement representative appears. Only the servants, the mistress, and heavy anticipation. When Dr. Fishbaugh finally arrives at the estate gates, the clock hands are approaching midnight. Together with Lucy, they approach the closed door of the guest room. The voice from behind the door belongs to Hugh Plunkett, the secretary and closest friend of the master of the house. Plunkett shouts for them not to enter. Immediately after, a second shot rings out. Then, complete silence falls. Dr. Fishbaugh kicks down the door and enters inside. Before him unfolds a scene that looks less like a crime than a theatrical production. Two bodies lie on the floor. Edward Ned Doe, Jr., the sole heir to one of the world's richest empires, lies on his back. He is dressed in a silk robe. Blood covers his face from a head wound. Next to him, face down, lies Hugh Plunkett. Under his body is the murder weapon, a Webley Colt .45 caliber revolver. The air is thick with the smell of burned gunpowder and the metallic scent of blood. Dr. Fishbaugh pronounces both men dead. However, what happens next contradicts all forensic protocols. The Beverly Hills police receive the call only at 2 a.m. More than 3 hours have passed since the first shot. During this time, the crime scene remains under the complete control of the family and their private security. When the detectives finally enter the room, they discover a detail that casts doubt on the official version of madness and suicide. Between the fingers of the right hand of the dead Hugh Plunkett, who allegedly just shot his friend and then himself, is a clenched cigarette. The ash on it is not tapped off. This is a physically impossible position for a person who pressed the trigger of a powerful .45 caliber revolver a second ago, the recoil of which is capable of dislocating the wrist. The pistol under Plunkett's body, according to the first officers, was still warm, although enough time had passed since the shots for the metal to cool. The temperature in the room was cool. There was suspiciously little blood on Plunkett's shirt for a head wound. By dawn, District Attorney Buren Fitz arrives at the mansion. He sees not just two corpses, he sees the end of a dynasty. Greystone, this colossal palace costing more than $3 million, a sum equivalent to $50 million in today's terms, was completed just 5 months ago. It was the most expensive private residence in California. 55 rooms, a bowling alley, a movie theater, stables. All of this was built as a monument to the eternity of the Doe family. Now, 150 days after the housewarming, the heir is dead. The press receives the official version instantly. Hugh Plunkett, suffering from a nervous disorder, in a fit of madness, killed his benefactor and took his own life. The case is closed with record speed. Less than 36 hours. No grand jury investigation, no recorded interrogations of the servants. The bodies are removed, the blood is washed from the parquet, and the story is buried under a layer of rumors. But behind this haste lies a fear much greater than the fear of murder. The death at Greystone is not the beginning of the story. It is the culmination of a brutal game that began 30 years earlier, when the first barrel of oil was extracted from the soil of Los Angeles. To understand who really pulled the trigger that night, one must go back to the place where oil was worth more than blood, and the law was merely a recommendation for those who owned the subsoil. We must look at the man who built this house, and at the price he paid to become a god in a world of mortal. To understand the anatomy of the murder at Greystone, it is necessary to rewind time back to the era when Los Angeles was not a city of movie stars, but a dusty settlement with a population of just 50,000 people. It was 1892. The city was choking on dust, its economy sustained by orange groves and tourists coming to cure tuberculosis in the dry climate. Into this world, devoid of glamour and prospects, rode a man whose ambition was harder than rock. His name was Edward Lawrence Doe. He was 36 years old, and he was a professional failure. Behind him were 20 years of fruitless searches for gold and silver in the deserts of New Mexico. He was a bankrupt, living in a cheap rented room, but he possessed that quality that distinguishes a dreamer from a titan. He could see the invisible. The story of the Doe family, and with it the history of modern California, began with one casual glance. One afternoon, while strolling down the street, Edward Doe noticed a cart loaded with a strange black substance. It was not coal dust, it was brea, thick tar that local residents used instead of fuel, as coal was prohibitively expensive. Most people saw in this muck only cheap fuel for the poor. Doe saw in it an ocean of energy. He followed the cart's path to the Westlake Park District and realized he was standing atop a huge reservoir. He had no money for professional drilling equipment. He had no geological maps. What happened next today seems like an unimaginable technological feat. On November 4th, 1892, Edward Doe and his partner Charles Canfield bought a small plot of land the size of a living room for $400. They began digging a shaft by hand, with picks and shovels. It was an act of pure physical desperation. Day after day, they delved deeper into the earth, choking on natural gas fumes, risking being buried alive in any collapse. At a depth of 155 feet, their makeshift shaft filled with black liquid. They created the first successful oil well in Los Angeles. This moment became a bifurcation point for the entire Western economy. Doe did not just find oil, he opened Pandora's box. Just 5 years after his discovery, there were already 2,300 wells in the city. Los Angeles turned into a forest of wooden derricks pumping black gold around the clock. But for a man of Doe's scale, this was not enough. His philosophy was simple and ruthless. If you control the resource, you write the laws. He was the embodiment of the American myth of the self-made man, but in his version, this myth was devoid of romance. It was war. At the beginning of the 20th century, he turned his gaze south to Mexico. There, in the impassable jungles near Tampico, geologists said there was no oil. Doe did not listen to them. He relied on the instinct of a predator. He bought hundreds of thousands of acres of land that locals considered useless and began drilling. It was in Mexico that the true scale of his empire manifested. In 1916, his company drilled the Cerro Azul No. 4 well. What happened when the reservoir was breached entered the history textbooks. The pressure was so monstrous that drilling tools weighing several tons flew out of the well like bullets. The column of oil rose into the sky to a height of 180 meters. The roar was heard 16 miles away. It was the most powerful oil well in the world, spewing 260,000 barrels per day. So you understand the scale. This one well produced more oil than all the other wells in the world combined at that time. Edward Doe became richer than John Rockefeller, if counting liquid assets at specific moments in time. His fortune was estimated at $100 million of that era. This is billions in modern equivalent. He ceased to be just a businessman. He became a political force. He funded revolutions in Mexico when it benefited him, and bought senators in Washington when he needed laws. His worldview was formed in harsh conditions. He survives who strikes first, and who controls the source of power. For him, oil was not just a commodity. It was the blood of civilization, and he held his hand on the artery. It was in this context, in the shadow of the colossal, overwhelming figure of his father, that his only son grew up. Edward Ned Doe Jr. He was born in 1893, almost simultaneously with the discovery of the first well. Ned never knew poverty. He never held a pickaxe in his hands. He never choked on gas in a shaft. He was a prince, born in an empire built by a barbarian. The conflict between father and son was embedded in the very foundation of their existence. Doe Sr. valued strength, risk, and the ability to survive. Ned was soft, educated, worldly. The father wanted to see in him a continuation of himself, a tough leader, capable of holding the empire in his fist. But Ned was different. He was a product of wealth, not struggle. He studied at the best universities, but did not go through the school of life that his father experienced in the deserts. To toughen his son, the father constantly brought him closer to the business, but did it with his characteristic harshness. Ned received the position of vice president in his father's company, but everyone knew who really made the decisions. This created a deep crack inside Ned. He desperately wanted to prove his worth to his father, but every step of his was controlled. He was the heir to a throne that was too big for him. It was this dynamic, the despotic founding father and the son seeking his place, that would lead to catastrophe. Doe Sr. believed that money could solve any problem. If there is an obstacle, buy it. If there is a law, rewrite it. He passed this philosophy on to his son. But he overlooked one thing. There are things that cannot be bought, and there is loyalty that can break under the pressure of fear. In this complex architecture of power, a third element appears that will become the catalyst of the tragedy. Hugh Plunkett. He was not a relative, but became closer to Ned than anyone else. They met when Ned was about 20 years old. Plunkett was from a more modest family, but possessed a sharp mind and charisma. He became Ned's secretary, his shadow, his voice. Where Ned was, Hugh was there too. Doe Sr. approved of this union, seeing in Plunkett a useful tool, a man who would watch over his son, help him in business. Plunkett gained access to the family's most intimate secrets. He knew the account numbers. He knew whom and how much they paid. He knew where the skeletons were hidden. Doe Sr., in his arrogance, considered Plunkett just another employee whom he had bought. He gave him a job, gave him status, gave him a life of luxury. He thought that this was enough for eternal loyalty. This was his fatal mistake. He did not understand that he had created a triangle of dependency that would one day close. By the mid-1920s, the Doe Empire reached its zenith. but clouds were already gathering over it. Washington was starting to ask questions. Competitors were looking for weak spots, and Doe Sr., confident in his invulnerability, was preparing his boldest move, a deal that was supposed to ensure his company's monopoly on supplying oil to the U.S. Navy. For this, he needed a man he could trust to carry a suitcase of cash. He chose his son, and the son took his shadow with him, Hugh Plunkett. Thus, in the foundation of California's greatest mansion, which would soon begin to be built on the Beverly Hills, the first stone of the future tragedy was laid. This was a stone of corruption, lies, and secret conspiracy, sealed by the signatures of two young men who did not even suspect that they were signing their own death warrants. The story of Greystone began not with architectural plans, but with a black satchel stuffed with $100 bills. By 1914, as Europe sank into the chaos of World War I, in sunny California, an alliance was forming that was meant to give the Doe oil money respectable shine. Edward Ned Doe Jr. marries Lucy Smith. This was not just a marriage, it was a strategic merger. Lucy was the embodiment of what Doe Sr. lacked: innate elegance and impeccable social pedigree. She was beautiful, intelligent, and, most importantly, she understood the rules of high society's game. This union was meant to transform the family from oil-stained nouveau riche into true American aristocracy. But in this marriage, from the very beginning, there was a third, invisible participant. A man who stood not at the altar, but in the shadows, holding a daily planner with meeting schedules. Hugh Plunkett. By the time of the wedding, he had become an integral part of Ned's life. If Lucy was the queen of this new court, and Ned the king, then Plunkett was the chancellor, keeper of the seal, and executor of dark errands. The dynamics of their relationship were strange even to contemporaries. They were inseparable: Ned, Lucy, and Hugh. The Three Musketeers, as they were called in narrow circles. Plunkett lived with them, traveled with them, managed their accounts. He became the mechanism that allowed Ned to function. Ned, often prone to melancholy and alcohol, needed a firm backbone, and that backbone was not himself, but his secretary. But the real turning point that determined the fate of Greystone occurred not in the ballrooms of Los Angeles, but in cold New York, at the end of November 1921. It was here that the event took place, known to historians as the handover of the Black Satchel. This was the moment when Doe Sr.'s ambition crossed the line of legality, and he dragged his son and his shadow into it. The situation was critical. Edward Doe Sr. set his sights on the Elk Hills oil reserves in California. These lands belonged to the U.S. Navy and were considered a strategic reserve in case of war. Drilling there was strictly prohibited, but Doe had a plan. His old friend, Albert Fall, had just been appointed Secretary of the Interior in President Warren Harding's administration. Fall had debts. He needed money to save his ranch in New Mexico. Doe needed oil. The deal was struck without unnecessary words: $100,000 in cash in exchange for exclusive drilling rights on Navy lands. However, Doe Sr., this old fox, was too cautious to carry the money himself. He knew his face was too well known. He needed a courier, a man who would not ask questions, a man whose loyalty was absolute. He chose his own son. On November 30th, 1921, Ned Doe and Hugh Plunkett entered the building of Blair and Company Bank in New York. It was at this moment that Hugh Plunkett made the mistake that would cost him his life 8 years later. The check for $100,000 was made out to Ned, but to cash such an amount, signatures were required. Ned signed the check, but the bank demanded confirmation. Hugh Plunkett, acting as a trusted agent, placed his signature next to it. This was documentary proof of complicity. From that moment, Plunkett ceased to be just a servant. He became an accomplice in a federal crime. They received the money, $100,000 in bills. They put them in an ordinary black leather satchel. Together they delivered this cargo to Secretary Fall in his room at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. The deal was done. Doe received the contract that would bring him another $100 million in profit. Fall received the money to save the ranch, and Ned and Hugh received a secret that would bind them tighter than any blood ties. They became carriers of the nuclear briefcase, capable of destroying not only themselves, but the entire U.S. presidential administration. As a reward for loyalty, and as a symbol of his triumph, Doe Sr. decides to give his son a gift. This was not just money. This was land. In 1926, when the first rumors of the bribe had already begun to leak to the press, the father gives Ned a plot of land in the Beverly Hills. 429 acres. The entire mountainside. A place from which one could look down on Los Angeles like gods looking at ants. The plan was grandiose. To build a house that would eclipse everything ever created on the West Coast. This was an attempt to buy legitimacy through architecture. If you live in a palace, you cannot be a criminal. That was the logic of the Gilded Age. Construction began on February 15, 1927. The date is symbolic, exactly 2 years before the murder. It was the merger of two worlds. On one side, the world of endless money extracted from the earth's depths, the world of bribes and secret deals. On the other, the world of high aesthetics, English parks, Gothic architecture, and aristocratic gloss that Lucy was to provide. The design was entrusted to architect Gordon Kaufman. The task was set clearly. Budget unlimited. Completely. While thousands of workers began blasting the rock of the hills to lay the foundation, in Washington, Senator Thomas Walsh began investigating the circumstances of the Elk Hills lease. Clouds were gathering. The story of Greystone is the story of a race. A race between builders erecting fortress walls and prosecutors tearing down walls of silence. Doe Sr. was building a golden cage for his son, hoping that the grandeur of stone would protect them from justice. 46,000 square feet. A steel frame capable of withstanding an earthquake. Concrete walls 1 meter thick. This was not just a house for the family. This was a bunker disguised as an English Tudor-era estate. Every brick, every beam was imbued with paranoia. Hugh Plunkett, whose signature was on the fateful document, now moves into this under-construction world with the family. His status changes. He is no longer just a secretary. He is the keeper of the key to the cell into which they all might soon be thrown. During this period, Ned and Lucy try to live the life of normal, rich people. They host receptions, attend horse races, travel to Europe buying antiques for the future home. But the shadow of Washington follows them at their heels. Lucy begins to notice changes in her husband. Ned drinks more and more. Hugh becomes increasingly nervous, his behavior more and more unpredictable. The strategic marriage and strategic friendship begin to crack under the pressure of the outside world. Greystone rose from the dust as a monument to this pressure. It was an architectural paradox. A house meant to demonstrate absolute power, built on money obtained through absolute fear of losing that power. The higher the mansion's walls rose, the deeper the family sank into isolation. They created their own world, separated from reality by gates, security, and millions of dollars, hoping that when the gates close, the past would remain outside. They were wrong. The past was already inside. It sat in the car with them. It dined at their table. It bore the name Hugh Plunkett. By September 1928, the scaffolding was finally removed, and on the hills of Beverly Hills stood a structure that least resembled a family nest. Greystone was not a home in the usual sense of the word. It was an architectural declaration of independence from the laws of ordinary people. When the massive steel gates first opened before the black limousine of Ned and Lucy Doe, they were entering not just a mansion, but a meticulously designed labyrinth created to overwhelm anyone who crossed its threshold. Architect Gordon Kaufman created something that simultaneously awed and frightened. The building's exterior was executed in the style of English Tudor Revival, but the scale was purely American, imperial. The walls were clad in gray limestone, specially brought from the state of Indiana. This stone gave the estate its name, Greystone. Greystone. The choice of material was not accidental. Limestone is cold, monumental, and practically eternal. It turned the house into a fortress. The thickness of the outer walls reached 3 feet. These were walls capable of withstanding artillery fire, walls through which no sound from the outside world could penetrate. And, more importantly, no cry from inside could be heard outside. The first thing that greeted a guest was the main entrance. Heavy oak doors opened into the great hall, a space that made a person feel insignificant. The floor was laid with black and white marble in a checkerboard pattern. It was a giant board where people were mere pieces. Light fell through tall leaded windows, creating geometric patterns on the floor that changed with the movement of the sun. There was no coziness here. Here was grandeur. The staircase leading to the second floor was so wide that 5 people could ascend it side by side. The balustrade of dark wood was polished to a mirror shine by the hands of dozens of craftsmen. Every room in this house was designed with the contrast between public mask and private anxiety in mind. The library, paneled in walnut, was filled with thousands of books and leather bindings, many of which were never opened. It was a decoration of wisdom. Huge fireplaces, in which an entire log could be burned whole, dominated the living rooms. But even when fire roared in them, the vast spaces of the rooms with 15-foot ceilings remained cool. Greystone was a house of drafts and echoes. The footsteps of the servants, of whom there were 32 on staff, sounded here like the beats of a metronome. But the true psychology of Ned Doe was revealed not in the grand halls, but in the entertainment areas. The house had an entire wing dedicated to escapism, flight from reality. Here was a full-sized movie theater where the family could watch films before their theatrical release. Here was a professional 2-lane bowling alley hidden in the depths of the house. A billiards room. All of this said one thing. The master of the house did not want to go outside. He was building an autonomous world where he did not need to meet the public, journalists, or investigators. Greystone was a golden cage with full board. Special significance was one detail hidden from the eyes of the uninitiated. In the Prohibition era, when alcohol was officially banned throughout the United States, Greystone had a secret bar designed. It was hidden behind an unassuming wooden panel. One press of a hidden spring, and the wall slid away, providing access to a store of elite whiskey and gin. This was the physical embodiment of the Doe family's double standards. The law exists for the poor, and for us, there are secret doors. It was here, in this hidden bar, that Ned and Hugh Plunkett spent hours, drowning the fear of the impending trial in alcohol. The walls of this room absorbed more confessions than a confessional. The owner's private quarters were on the second floor. Ned and Lucy's bedroom was isolated from the guest wing by a long corridor. This architectural decision would become fatal on the night of the murder. The distance between the eastern wing, where Hugh Plunkett was housed, and the owner's bedroom was nearly 100 feet. This was the space that needed to be crossed, the space giving time for second thoughts, or conversely, the space separating the victim from help. The bedroom windows opened onto terraces with a view of Los Angeles sprawling below. The city of lights, the city of oil derricks, the city they had conquered lay at their feet, but they were cut off from it by the height of the hill and an electrified fence. The garden around the house was a continuation of this philosophy of control. 18 acres of land were transformed into a series of terraces, fountains, and alleys. The cypress alley leading to the Italian garden was planted so densely that even at noon, semi-darkness reigned there. The water in the fountains murmured soothingly, but this sound only masked the silence of isolation. The construction cost more than $3 million in 1928. If translated into the language of labor of that time, this equaled the lifetime earnings of approximately 300 ordinary workers. The family moved into Greystone in the fall of 1928. This was a moment of triumph. Newspapers enthusiastically described the interiors, calling the house the Versailles of the West. But behind the facade of grandeur, decay was already beginning. The house was too large for 3 people, Ned, Lucy, and their small children. It weighed on them. The space demanded filling, and there was nothing to fill it with except anxiety. Hugh Plunkett, whose mental state was deteriorating day by day, became a constant ghost in these corridors. He had his own key. He knew all the entrances and exits. He knew how to pass to the library unnoticed. He knew where the alcohol was hidden. The architecture of the house, intended to protect the family from the outside world, proved powerless against the threat they themselves had let inside. Moreover, the house itself, with its endless corridors and isolated wings, created ideal conditions for tragedy. Here one could fire a shot, and in another wing, no one would even tear their gaze from a book. The walls of Greystone were built to stand for centuries. They were made of stone that had formed over millions of years. But the human psyche, locked inside these walls, proved a far more fragile material. By January 1929, just 4 months after the housewarming, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Servants whispered about screams behind closed doors, about Hugh Plunkett's nighttime wanderings as he roamed the house like a shadow, checking the locks as if expecting an assault. The house was ready. The stage was set. The scenery of marble and gold was in place. All that remained was to await the actors who would perform the final act of the bloody drama. And they did not keep them waiting. By the beginning of 1929, the air inside Greystone had become so thick with tension that it could be cut with a knife. The outside world knew only of the brilliant receptions and the housewarming of the heir to the oil crown. But behind closed doors, a Greek tragedy was unfolding, where love, loyalty, and fear were woven into a deadly knot. The center of this knot was not Ned Doe, nor even his powerful father. It was Hugh Plunkett, the man who 8 years earlier had lightly signed the documents at the bank, now realized that his signature had become a death sentence. The trial of Edward Doe Sr. in the Teapot Dome case was entering its decisive phase. Subpoenas had been issued. Both Ned and Hugh were to appear before the Senate. They had a choice: either lie under oath and commit another federal crime, or tell the truth and send Ned's father, the man who gave them everything, to prison for the rest of his days. For Ned Doe, this dilemma was agonizing, but he was protected by his name, money, and the best lawyers in America. Hugh Plunkett had no such armor. He was expendable material. In his mind, a paranoid thought began to take root. The Doe family was going to make him the scapegoat. He was the only witness who could confirm the bribe delivery, and if he disappeared or was deemed insane, the case against Doe Sr. could fall apart. In January 1929, Plunkett's behavior became uncontrollable. Greystone servants later recounted how he wandered the mansion's corridors at 3 o'clock in the morning, checking if the windows were locked. He burst into Ned and Lucy's bedroom without knocking, demanding assurances that they would not abandon him. He shouted, cried, threatened. This was a personality breakdown live. Here, Lucy Doe steps onto the stage. If Ned was paralyzed by guilt and attachment to his childhood friend, Lucy thought like a mother and protector of her status. She saw Plunkett no longer as a family friend, but as a time bomb planted in the foundation of their life. It was she who began to insist on a radical solution. In early February, the family makes a decision that will become the catalyst for the murder. They turn to Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh, the same doctor who will pronounce death a few days later. The medical verdict was harsh. Hugh Plunkett suffers from a severe nervous disorder. He needs to be isolated. The family suggests, and effectively orders, Hugh to check into a sanatorium for the mentally ill. For Plunkett, this sounded not like care. It sounded like eliminating a witness. In his inflamed mind, a picture formed. They want to declare him insane so that his testimony in court has no weight. Or, worse, to lock him up forever, while Doe Sr. walks away unscathed. The situation reached a boiling point on February 16th. This was not just the day of the murder. It was the day when Plunkett was supposed to give his final answer on hospitalization. The moral ambiguity of this situation is striking. On one hand, Ned Doe appears as the victim of a madman, but if you look closely, we see a man who for years exploited his friend's loyalty, drew him into a criminal scheme, made him an accomplice, and when things got hot, agreed to the plan to isolate that friend. Ned loved Hugh. Their bond was deep, possibly the most sincere in his life. But he was too weak to go against his father's will and the logic of self-preservation. Plunkett felt this betrayal in every cell of his body. He was a man who had sold his soul to the devil for a friend, and now that friend looked at him as a problem to be solved with doctors and bars. On that fateful evening, Hugh Plunkett came to Greystone not just to talk. He came for justice in his distorted understanding. The staff recalled that dinner that evening passed in deathly silence. Ned and Lucy sat at the long table in the dining room, paneled in mahogany. Hugh was not at the table, but his presence was felt everywhere. He was somewhere in the house, in his room in the eastern wing, with the Webley Colt pistol that he had acquired shortly before. Around 10 in the evening, Lucy and Ned retired to their bedroom. It seemed the storm had passed, but at 10:30 p.m., Hugh Plunkett called the owner's bedroom via the internal line. The conversation was short. Ned, despite his wife's protests, got up, put on his silk robe, and said he would go talk to Hugh. "I must calm him down," were probably his last words addressed to his wife. This was the moment of truth. Ned Doe stepped out of the safe zone of his marriage, walked down the long corridor connecting the western and eastern wings, and stepped toward his fate. He was not walking to an enemy. He was walking to a man who knew everything about him. He was walking, perhaps hoping to use his charm again, to promise once more that everything would be fine. But this time, words meant nothing. In the room at the end of the corridor, he was awaited not by a friend, but by a judge, jury, and executioner in one person. The tragedy of Greystone is not just a story of madness. It is a story of how enormous money and enormous power crush the human psyche. Doe Sr. bought his son a palace to protect him, but this palace became a trap. He bought his son a friend to watch over him, but this friend became a murderer. On that night, when Ned Doe opened the door to the guest bedroom, he did not meet Plunkett's madness. He met the consequences of his own compromises. And the price for these compromises was paid in lead. Immediately after the bodies of Edward Doe Jr.
and Hugh Plunkett were carried out of the mansion in the pre-dawn twilight of February 17th, an operation began in Greystone that could be called the most expensive cleaning in California history. This was not just cleaning blood from the parquet. This was a sanitization of reality. District Attorney Buren Fitz, a man who owed his career to the support of oil magnates, closed the case with such speed as if it were a routine traffic accident, and not the death of the heir to a $100 million fortune. The official version of Plunkett's madness and suicide was cemented in the protocols, despite glaring inconsistencies. The absence of gunpowder on the shooter's hands in the first reports, the strange bullet trajectory, and that very mysterious cigarette. Why such haste? The answer lay not in Beverly Hills, but in Washington. The trial of Edward Doe Sr. for giving a bribe was scheduled for the near future. The deaths of Ned and Hugh became, however cynical it sounds, the ideal legal solution for protecting the patriarch. Two key witnesses, who personally transported the money and could confirm the fact of the crime, fell silent forever. The dead do not give testimony. The dead cannot identify the black satchel. What occurred is what legal historians call the greatest paradox of American justice in the 1920s. In 1930, a year after the murder, Edward Doe Sr. was acquitted by a jury. His lawyers brilliantly played on the jury's emotions. Before them sat not a greedy oligarch, but a broken old man who had lost his only son. How can one judge a father who has already paid the highest price? The jurors cried. Doe was freed. The irony lay in the fact that Secretary Albert Fall, who took that very bribe, was found guilty and sent to prison. The court ruled that the bribe was received, but not given. This was an absurdity that became reality, thanks to the death at Greystone. But this victory was Pyrrhic. Edward Doe Sr., the man who could drill through the earth and extract wealth from it, proved powerless before the emptiness that settled in his soul. He won the trial, but lost his life. He died in 1935, just 6 years after his son. His empire remained, but his dream of a dynasty was shattered by a .45 caliber shot. Meanwhile, in Greystone itself, another transformation was occurring. Lucy Doe, the widow left in this stone labyrinth with 55 rooms, had to make a decision. Most women in her place would have fled the house where the corridors still seemed to smell of gunpowder. But Lucy showed steel character worthy of the name she bore. She stayed. She lived in the house for another 25 years. 3 years after the tragedy, she married investment banker Lee Batson, but they continued to live in Greystone. However, the house was changing. From a symbol of ambition and power, it was turning into a gilded burden. Maintaining the estate required an army of servants and colossal expenses. In the era of the Great Depression and then World War II, such luxury seemed not just excessive, but almost indecent. Greystone became a relic of a bygone era, a dinosaur dying in a new climate. Psychologically, it weighed on the inhabitants. The children grew up playing in the bowling alley and movie theater, but the shadow of the eastern wing, where the tragedy occurred, never faded.
Servants whispered that doors there opened by themselves, and footsteps were heard at night. These were not ghosts in a mystical sense. This was the memory of the walls. In 1955, Lucy Doe finally gave in. She sold the estate. But the buyer was not another billionaire. Times had changed, and no one wanted to live like a king in democratic America anymore. The land was sold to a development company. The house, which had cost millions, became a burden. It was planned to be demolished. In place of the majestic gardens and terraces, they intended to build a giant water reservoir for 19 million gallons to supply the growing Beverly Hills. This was a critical moment. Greystone, built on dirty oil money, which became the scene of a bloody drama, stood one step away from complete destruction. Bulldozers were ready to turn the Indian limestone into gravel. The story could have ended here, forgotten, erased, buried under tons of water and concrete. But something unexpected happened. The city of Beverly Hills intervened. In 1965, the municipality bought the estate. This decision became a turning point in the object's fate. The house ceased to be private property, a closed fortress storing one family's dark secrets. It became public domain. In 1971, the park was opened to the public. The gates, which had been closed to ordinary mortals for half a century, swung open. Here begins the most astonishing metamorphosis of Greystone. The house, built on real blood, became the most popular set for fictional blood. Hollywood discovered Greystone for itself. Its dark, Gothic aesthetic, its endless corridors, and majestic staircases became the ideal backdrop for cinema. It was here that scenes for dozens of cult films were shot. The Big Lebowski, There Will Be Blood, X-Men, Spider-Man. In Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood, which is partially based on Doe's own biography, the final scene takes place in Greystone's bowling alley. The circle closed. Art began to rework the real tragedy, turning it into myth. The transformation was complete. The place where Ned Doe and Hugh Plunkett met their end in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia is now filled with tourists with cameras, wedding photographers, and film crews. The horror of the past was sterilized by time and turned into aesthetics. Greystone ceased to be the house of murder. It became a cultural artifact. But this transcendence has another side. Having turned into a park and a filming location, Greystone allowed society to forget what actually begot this house. We admire the architecture, stroll the alleys, watch the films, but rarely think about the price paid for this stone. About the fact that every inch of this grandeur was paid for with a bribe, betrayal, and 2 lives cut short in a cold February night. The house survived, but it lost its soul, becoming an empty shell into which each new generation pours its own meanings. However, if you find yourself there today, on a quiet weekday when there are no film crews or weddings, and approach the eastern wing, you can still feel the weight of this place. The architecture remembers what people have forgotten. The stone still holds the cold of that night. Greystone stands as a monument not only to wealth, but also to loneliness. It reminds us that even the thickest walls cannot protect a person from their own demons, and that even the biggest money cannot buy off conscience. The Doe family's crisis did not end in a courtroom, but here, in the empty corridors where the echo of gunshots was replaced by the clicks of camera shutters. The story of Ned Doe and Hugh Plunkett is not just a crime chronicle of 1929. It is a warning carved in limestone. It tells us that there is a limit beyond which wealth ceases to be a tool of freedom and becomes a tool of destruction. Edward Doe Sr. believed that oil could be exchanged for everything, for power,
for law, for the immortality of his lineage. He was wrong. Oil gave him money, but took away his future. His line ended in the direct male descent. His name became a synonym for corruption, and his greatest construction project turned into a set for other people's stories. There is a cruel irony in this history. The house, designed as an impregnable fortress for the elite, now belongs to everyone. The walls, erected to hide one family's secrets, are now open to anyone who buys a ticket. What was supposed to become a dynastic nest for centuries served the family for just 5 months. This reminds us of the fragility of human plans in the face of fate. Comparing this story to F. Scott Fitzgerald's great novel, The Great Gatsby, we see striking parallels. Like Gatsby, the Does tried to build paradise on Earth, ignoring moral laws. And just like in the novel, retribution came not from outside, but from within. The shot at Greystone was the echo of the world they themselves created, a world where human relationships were subordinated to transactions, where friendship was measured in signatures on checks, and loyalty was ensured by fear. Today, Greystone stands as a silent reproach to modern empire builders. We see how new industry titans build their bunkers, buy islands, and try to isolate themselves from the world they are changing. Greystone whispers to them across the decades, "Walls do not save. The most dangerous enemy is always inside the perimeter." He sits at the same table with you. He knows your passwords. He holds your secrets. When you watch the next Hollywood blockbuster filmed in the interiors of this mansion, look closely at the details. Behind the glossy image of a superhero action movie or historical drama lies the real texture of tragedy. This cold gray stone absorbed the last breath of a friendship that could not withstand the test of greed. Edward Doe Sr. sought black gold in the earth's depths, but found only emptiness. Greystone is his true legacy. It is an empty, magnificent shell. Beautiful, majestic, and utterly dead. And in this silence that falls when the tourists leave, one can hear the main lesson of this story. You can buy land. You can buy the law. You can even buy people, but you can never buy peace.